Tynan Portillo presents, featuring the best horror stories of the 19th century. Welcome to the Poe Show Podcast. Narrated by Tynan Portillo. Today's episode, a famous ghost story, The Striding Place, by Gertrude Atherton. This striding place is called the Strid, a name which it took of yore. 1,000 years hath it borne that name, and shall 1,000 more. And hither is young Romilly come, and what may now forbid that he, perhaps for the 100th time, shall bound across the Strid? He sprang in glee, or what cared he that the river was strong and the rocks were steep? But the greyhound in the leash lung back, and checked him in his leap. The boy is in the arms of Wharf, and strangled by a merciless force. For nevermore was young Romilly seen, till he rose a lifeless corse. Weagle, continental and detached, tired early of grouse shooting. To stand propped against a sod fence while his host's workmen routed up the birds with long poles and drove them towards the waiting guns made him feel himself a parody on the ancestors who had roamed the moors and forests of this West Riding of Yorkshire in hot pursuit of game worth the killing. But when in England in August, he always accepted whatever proffered for the season, and invited his host to shoot pheasants on his estate in the south. The amusements of life, he argued, should be accepted with the same philosophy as its ills. It had been a bad day. A heavy rain had made the moor so spongy that it fairly sprang beneath the feet. Whether or not the grouse had haunts of their own, wherein they were immune from rheumatism, the bag had been small. The women, too, were an unusually dull lot, with the exception of a new-minded debutante who bothered Weagle at dinner by demanding the verbal restoration of the vague paintings on the vaulted roof above them. But it was no one of these things that sat on Weagle's mind as, when the other men went up to bed, he let himself out of the castle and sauntered down to the river. His intimate friend, the companion of his boyhood, the chum of his college days, his fellow traveler in many lands, the man for whom he possessed stronger affection than for all men, had mysteriously disappeared 2 days ago. And his track might have sprung to the upper air for all trace he had left behind him. He had been a guest on the adjoining estate during the past week, shooting with the fervor of the true sportsman, making love in the intervals to Adeline Cavan, and apparently in the best of spirits. As far as was known, there was nothing to lower his mental mercury, for his rent roll was a large one. Miss Cavan blushed whenever he looked at her, and being one of the best shots in England, he was never happier than in August. The suicide theory was preposterous, all agreed, and there was as little reason to believe him murdered. Nevertheless, he had walked out of March Abbey 2 nights ago, without hat or overcoat, and had not been seen since. The country was being patrolled night and day. 100 keepers and workmen were beating the woods and poking the bogs on the moors, but as yet, not so much as a handkerchief had been found. Weagle did not believe for a moment that Wyatt Gifford was dead, and although it was impossible not to be affected by the general uneasiness, he was disposed to be more angry than frightened. At Cambridge, Gifford had been an incorrigible practical joker, and by no means had outgrown the habit. It would be like him to cut across the country in his evening clothes, board a cattle train, and amuse himself touching up the picture of the sensation in West Riding. However, Weagle's affection for his friend was too deep to companion with tranquility in the present state of doubt, and, instead of going to bed early with the other men, he determined to walk until ready for sleep. He went down to the river and followed the path through the woods. There was no moon, but the stars sprinkled their cold light upon the pretty belt of water, flowing placidly past wood and ruin, between green masses of overhanging rocks, or sloping banks tangled with tree and shrub, leaping occasionally over stones with the harsh notes of an angry scold, to recover its equanimity the moment the way was clear again. It was very dark in the depths where Weagle trod. He smiled as he recalled a remark of Gifford's. An English wood is like a good many other things in life, very promising at a distance, but a hollow mockery when you get within. You see daylight on both sides, and the sun freckles the very bracken. Our woods need the night to make them seem what they ought to be, what they once were, before our ancestors' descendants demanded so much more money in these so much more various days. Weagle strolled along, smoking, and thinking of his friend, his pranks, many of which had done more credit to his imagination than this, and recalling conversations that had lasted the night through. Just before the end of the London season, they had walked the streets one hot night after a party, discussing the various theories of the soul's destiny. That afternoon, they had met at the coffin of a college friend, whose mind had been a blank for the past 3 years. Some months previously, they had called at the asylum to see him. His expression had been senile, his face imprinted with the record of debauchery. In death, the face was placid, intelligent, without ignoble lineation, the face of the man they had known at college. Weagle and Gifford had had no time to comment there, and the afternoon and evening were full. But coming forth from the house of festivity together, they had reverted almost at once to the topic. "I cherish the theory," Gifford had said, "that the soul sometimes lingers in the body after death. During madness, of course, it is an impotent prisoner, albeit a conscious one. Fancy its agony and its horror. What more natural than that when the life spark goes out? The tortured soul should take possession of the vacant skull and triumph once more for a few hours while old friends look their last. It has had time to repent while compelled to crouch and behold the result of its work, and it has shrived itself into a state of comparative purity. If I had my way, I should stay inside my bones until the coffin had gone into its niche, that I might obviate for my poor old comrade the tragic impersonality of death. And I should like to see justice done to it, as it were, to see it lowered among its ancestors with the ceremony and solemnity that are its due. I am afraid that if I dissevered myself too quickly, I should yield to curiosity and hasten to investigate the mysteries of space." "You believe in the soul as an independent entity, then, that it and the vital principle are not one and the same?" "Absolutely. The body and soul are twins, life comrades. Sometimes friends, sometimes enemies, but always loyal in the last instance. Some day, when I am tired of the world, I shall go to India and become a Mahatma, solely for the pleasure of receiving proof during life of this independent relationship." Suppose you were not sealed up properly, and returned after one of your astral flights to find your earthly part unfit for habitation. It is an experiment I don't think I should care to try, unless even juggling with soul and flesh had palled. That would not be an uninteresting predicament. I should rather enjoy experimenting with broken machinery. The high, wild roar of water smote suddenly upon Weagle's ear and checked his memories. He left the wood and walked out on the huge slippery stones, which were nearly close to the river wharf at this point, and watched the waters boil down into the narrow pass with their furious, untiring energy. The black quiet of the woods rose high on either side. The stars seemed colder and whiter just above. On either hand, the perspective of the river might have run into a rayless cavern. There was no lonelier spot in England, nor one which had the right to claim so many ghosts, if ghosts there were. Weagle was not a coward, but he recalled uncomfortably the tales of those that had been done to death in the Strid. Wordsworth's boy of Egremont had been disposed of by the practical Whitaker, but countless others, more venturesome than wise, had gone down into that narrow, boiling course, never to appear in the still pool a few yards beyond. Below the great rocks which formed the walls of the Strid was believed to be a natural vault, onto whose shelves the dead were drawn. The spot had an ugly fascination. Weagle stood, visioning skeletons, uncoffined and green, the home of the eyeless things, which had devoured all that had covered and filled that rattling symbol of man's mortality. Then fell to wondering if anyone had attempted to leap the Strid of late. It was covered with slime. He had never seen it look so treacherous. He shuddered and turned away, impelled, despite his manhood, to flee the spot. As he did so, something tossing in the foam below the fall, something as white, yet independent of it, caught his eye and arrested his step. Then he saw that it was describing a contrary motion to the rushing water, an upward, backward motion. Weagle stood rigid, breathless. He fancied he heard the crackling of his hair. Was that a hand? It thrust itself still higher above the boiling foam, turned sideways, and 4 frantic fingers were distinctly visible against the black rock beyond. Weagle's superstitious terror left him. A man was there, struggling to free himself from the suction beneath the Strid, swept down, doubtless, but a moment before his arrival, perhaps as he stood with his back to the current. He stepped as close to the edge as he dared. The hand doubled, as if in imprecation, shaking savagely in the face of that force which leaves its creatures to immutable law, then spread wide again, clutching, expanding, crying for help as audibly as the human voice. Weagle dashed to the nearest tree, dragged and twisted off a branch with his strong arms, and returned as swiftly to the Strid. The hand was in the same place, still gesticulating as wildly. The body was undoubtedly caught in the rocks below, perhaps already halfway along one of those hideous shelves. Weagle let himself down upon a lower rock, braced his shoulder against the mass beside him, then, leaning out over the water, thrust the branch into the hand. The fingers clutched it convulsively. Weagle tugged powerfully, his own feet dragged perilously near the edge. For a moment, he produced no impression. Then, an arm shot above the waters. The blood sprang to Weagle's head. He was choked with the impression that the Strid had him in her roaring hold, and he saw nothing. Then the mist cleared. The hand and arm were nearer, although the rest of the body was still concealed by the foam. Weagle peered out with distended eyes. The meager light revealed in the cuffs links of a peculiar device. The fingers clutching the branch were as familiar. Weagle forgot the slippery stones, the terrible death if he stepped too far. He pulled with passionate will and muscle. Memories flung themselves into the hot light of his brain, trooping rapidly upon each other's heels, as in the thought of the drowning. Most of the pleasures of his life, good and bad, were identified in some way with this friend. Scenes of college days, of travel, where they had deliberately sought adventure and stood between one another and death upon more occasions than one, of hours of delightful companionship among the treasures of art, and others in the pursuit of pleasure, flashed like the changing particles of a kaleidoscope. Weagle had loved several women, but he would have flouted in these moments the thought that he had ever loved any woman as he loved Wyatt Gifford. There were so many charming women in the world, and in the 32 years of his life, he had never known another man to whom he had cared to give his intimate friendship. His wrists were cracking, the skin was torn from his hands, the fingers still gripped the stick. There was life in them yet. Suddenly, something gave way. The hand swung about, tearing the branch from Weagle's grasp. The body had been liberated and flung outward, though still submerged by the foam and spray. Weagle scrambled to his feet and sprang along the rocks, knowing that the danger from suction was over and that Gifford must be carried straight to the quiet pool. Gifford was a fish in the water and could live under it longer than most men. If he survived this, it would not be the first time that his pluck and science had saved him from drowning. Weagle reached the pool. A man in his evening clothes floated on it, his face turned towards a projecting rock over which his arm had fallen, upholding the body. The hand that had held the branch hung limply over the rock, its white reflection visible in the black water. Weagle plunged into the shallow pool, lifted Gifford in his arms, and returned to the bank. He laid the body down and threw off his coat that he might be the freer to practice the method of resuscitation. He was glad of the moment's respite. The valiant life in the man might have been exhausted in that last struggle. He had not dared to look at his face, to put his ear to the heart. The hesitation lasted but a moment. There was no time to lose. He turned to his prostrate friend. As he did so, something strange and disagreeable smote his senses. For a half moment, he did not appreciate its nature. Then his teeth clacked together. His feet, his outstretched arms, pointed towards the woods. But he sprang to the side of the man and bent down and peered into his face. There was no face. Hello from the Poe Show. I am your host, Tynan Portillo. You wanted it, you got it. People were sending fan mail to the show requesting another ghost story, so I hope you enjoyed this spooky tale. And if you did, then like this episode, subscribe to this podcast, share it with your family and friends, and give this podcast a good rating to expose it to more people. I also want to say thank you so much to our subscribers on YouTube. We have 38. It makes me so happy. A massive, massive thank you for subscribing and listening. It means the world to me. I can't see how many subscribers I have on, for instance, Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or maybe there is and I just don't know how to look at it, but I can see that right on YouTube. So if you are subscribed to this podcast, thank you so much for listening. And if any of you listeners, my Posho pals, would like to hear any other classic ghost stories on this podcast, you can send an anonymous text message using the link in the description, or email poshopod@gmail.com, or you can even comment on the Posho YouTube channel. And a quick little announcement, I did have someone contact me recently and give me permission to put their material on my podcast and narrate some of their material. So we're going to have a live guest author, not someone who's been dead for 100 or 200 years, but someone who's actually a writer today. So I'm really excited to do that. That's going to be coming out in September, going to be one of our September episodes. So look forward to that. And a little bonus gift, I guess, is going to be on the Posho YouTube channel. Well, I don't want to give spoilers, but maybe I'll talk about it in the next episode. It's going to be it's just going to be a fun video that you're going to want to watch. I'll give you more details in the next episode. Anyway, on to the after talk. The Striding Place was first published in 1896 under a different title, The Twins, referring to the nature of the body and the soul. But Gertrude Atherton revised the story in 1905. She recounted this tale as, quote, the best short story I ever wrote. If I could give a color to this story, I think it would be blue, like a dark, ominous blue. The kind of feeling that I got while reading this went from dreary to ethereal to chilling, and that blue image was in my head while I composed the music for this story. So I wanted that eeriness in the background of what was happening, making it all feel like a dream. And that's what I always strive to do when I compose music for an episode, is take what I'm feeling and create the sounds that make me feel that. Now, as far as the story goes, we follow Weagle, who is in such sour moods that he can't possibly enjoy hunting grouse at this time because his dearest friend Gifford has recently gone missing. He reminisces over the happy times he spent with Gifford and the many pranks he would pull. Then, as Weagle takes a nightly stroll, he sees a hand reaching up out of the nearby water of the Strid, and he runs over to pull this person out of the water, grabbing a tree branch to do so, but he fails. He has to follow the body because it just got dislodged, and it goes downriver and eventually rests upon a rock. So he grabs the body, that of Gifford, and sees that the body has no face. Honestly, when I first read that, I thought of that one scene from the Pirates of the Caribbean, the Dead Man's Chest movie, where Will Turner finds that ship that's been attacked by the Kraken, and then he sees that one man who had his face suctioned clean off. Yeah, that scene scared me as a kid, but that's what this reminded me of. I found this ghost story very different from others that I've read before as well. The nature of most classic ghost stories, at least those from the Victorian era, which this one would have technically fallen into, at least by its first publication, most of them were a form of escapism and macabre entertainment for a cold winter night next to the fire. And they turned into a major tradition because printing presses began to get a lot better and faster, and suddenly they needed more content for regular schedules. So publishers turned to authors who could write many entertaining short stories, specializing in magazines. It could be argued that the general population was also more superstitious at that time because they developed strange rituals like photographing dead children and covering up mirrors to prevent trapping the soul in the house. But there were plenty of factors like gas lamps that would give people hallucinations because of the fumes, and lead plates poisoning food that would lead to people believing in a superstitious apparition. There's a reason that in A Christmas Carol, Ebenezer Scrooge says, "There's more gravy than grave about you," to his dead partner Jacob Marley. Although for this episode, this was technically a ghost story without a ghost. It was morbid, to be sure. That's why I wanted to begin the episode with the bird call and the shotgun to start off the story with death. But this story is more of a question with an unclear answer. The story infers that Gifford experiences his body being mangled in the Strid. Perhaps he was experimenting with broken machinery, as he said. But the absence of a face says that Gifford has lost his identity, that his soul is no longer with his body, and the answer as to where his soul went is unknown. What's interesting is that the whole story feels eerily similar to a funeral procession. You think about the order of events. People who know Gifford become very invested in his life now that he's absent. Many people hope that he's in a safe place. Weigel recalls good times with him, but is plainly in mourning. He even makes a joke that this is exactly the kind of prank that Gifford would pull, exhibiting a sort of coping mechanism. And suddenly, events associated with death, like hunting grouse, make Weigel feel uneasy. When he gets a chance to rescue his friend and see Gifford again, even at a risk to his own life, he tries desperately to bring him back onto shore, or a metaphorical land of the living. But the river is too powerful, and it swiftly rushes Gifford away. And the only thing left of Gifford is his body. And it seems like the water was trying to bury him, And for context, the Strid is a series of, it's a river, and it's got a series of tunnels underneath it. And that is what the story was explaining, is that people would get swept away by this current, and then they would get pulled under, and they might get lost into one of these caves and caverns, and the Strid technically buries people. The text also says that Weigel had loved Gifford more than any of the several women he had ever loved, but I'm not 100% confident that this was to be taken as a romantic love. It could be so, or it could be the kind of bond that brothers might share. So I think that's more up to your interpretation. It's quite possible that, as many authors do, Gertrude was writing something based on her own life. She had lost her son to diphtheria, and her husband died at sea. And the River Wharfe is a real place. The Strid is an actual area in Yorkshire, England, with waterfalls that have claimed many people's lives because there are caverns underneath the water, like I said, and the rapids quickly draw people under. So here's a little bit more about the author. She started writing because she had married rich, but found life in her big, lonely mansion very boring, and she wanted to start a more independent venture in her life. She was a suffragist, and is it suffragette? And she was very outspoken as a feminist, but she despised the idea of using violence to enact political progress. And I mean, you got to guess at this point, because I'm reading works from classic authors here, but she was also racist and a white supremacist. It's a shame, but it's to be expected of that time period, honestly. That's actually something that I've been asked about before. I've been asked how I feel as a minority, right? Narrating these stories of people who probably would have hated me, or, I don't know what they would have thought of me. Just to be frank, I don't care. I think their fictional works are bigger than the authors themselves are, and I kind of feel like I'm taking back a point from history by reading their stories. And I can appreciate the progress that they supported and advocated for, while acknowledging that they are human beings who have flaws, who lived in a time of very new ideas. I don't excuse their actions, it's just a part of history. Anyway, the Striding Place expertly expresses the fear of the unknown, and it doesn't try to give any answer as to the destination of the soul. It doesn't explore nihilism or spirituality or any kind of religion. Rather, it focuses on the experience that death has on those still living. People miss Gifford. He had friends and family. And although the morbid thought of his faceless body sends chills up my neck, the story also demonstrates that his identity still remains within the memories of those still living. Gifford has stayed. He stayed with the people he affected in his life. And I think that's a touching message, despite the gruesome ending of the story. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Poe Show. You can follow this horror podcast on Instagram and Threads at The Poe Show Podcast and on TikTok at The Poe Show to support the show and get sneak peeks of new episodes. Remember that I've got those two special things coming up, the story from a guest author coming in September, and a little bonus thing coming to the Poe Show YouTube channel. Well, that's all for now, but I'll talk to you again on the next episode of The Poe Show.